Hello, and welcome to this episode for Middle Ages for Educators. Today we're going to be talking to you about medieval maps and mapping and map making. The three of us have, in the last several months, put together a bibliography as an introduction to medieval maps, and we are now doing this video to introduce you to the topic more broadly and to the bibliography and other resources specifically. So we'll take a quick moment to introduce ourselves, and then we'll get into what medieval maps are and what they look like and what they can look like, and then we'll touch on some of the resources. So I'll pass this off to Helen.
Hi, I'm Helen Davies. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. And I really got into maps because I'm really interested in how people map their understanding of the world around them. For instance, Colchis and Georgia are really important to people in the Middle Ages because that's where Jason and the Argonauts went.
I'm Tobias Hrynick. I'm a PhD candidate at Fordham University in the history department. I'm an environmental historian, and I kind of came into maps accidentally, but I've stayed with maps since getting involved with them accidentally, because from the point of view of an environmental historian, they're this marvelous way of getting directly at how people saw the world around them. This very direct, very visual way.
And my name is John Wyatt Greenlee. I recently finished my doctoral degree at Cornell University in medieval studies, where I started out focusing on maps and cartographic history because I think that maps are a really interesting way of unlocking sort of access points to different time periods in the ways that people are perceiving the world around them. That led to a dissertation on eels and the role of eels in history, but that came from looking at eels on medieval maps and wondering what they were doing there. So maps are a really useful tool for getting into a lot of different avenues of history and ways of thinking about the past. So.
And we put this project together along with Chris Rouse, our friend who couldn't make it for this video, but who was also involved in the organization and compilation of this resource. So we want to give a shout out to him as well.
So we're going to take a couple minutes here and walk through some of the ways that medieval people map the world around them and what those can look like. And I'm going to share our screen here for a slideshow, and we're going to start with Helen.
So our bibliography does focus on maps from around the world, but today we're going to talk mostly about Latin Christian maps. And the most famous of this type of map is the Mapamundi. So the Mapamundi is based on the underlying structure of Mapamundi is based on these TO maps. And these are these diagrams that show the world in three different parts. So Asia is at the top, so medieval maps were oriented to the east, literally oriented. And Asia is at the top. Then at the bottom you have Europe, and then you have Africa. And the TO map is a great little diagram here that shows this very clearly. In the Mapamundi, you get the same structure, but it's less hard to see sometimes. And this little TO map is very commonly found in Isidora's etymologies. So we are going to show you a brief map of the globe. And so, we get very used to thinking of the world around us in a very specific way. However, if you look at the world from a different angle, you can understand it radically differently. So here is a map of the world seen from the poles. And here, if you look at this, you can actually sort of understand the orientation of Mapamundi better. So if you see Asia at the top there, if you focus on this little bit in the center, right here, you can actually understand the layout of the continents on the Mapamundi. Okay, so here we have the Hereford map. The Hereford map is the most famous of the Mapamundi that survive. We know there used to be a lot more of these wall maps than have made it into the present historical record. We have evidence of ones on walls. We have evidence of ones in written records that used to be there. We have fragments of ones. We have just the corner of the Duchy of Cornwall map, and that's it. So this is the Hereford map. It is an example of the kind of things that you can use our bibliography to investigate. As I was just mentioning with the TO map, you have Asia at the top, you have Africa off to the bottom corner, and then you have Europe on the other bottom corner. You can see the same water structure in the middle dividing the different continents. And they contain a lot more information than just the schematic in the TO map. So you can see a variety of different things. This is the Ebstorf map. The Ebstorf map is a famous contemporary of the Hereford map within the same century or so. And like the Hereford map, it has the same underlying structure in the TO map, though on this one, it is significantly harder to see. Though Asia is again at the top, and you have Europe and Africa in the bottom two corners. As you can see, as with the Hereford map, it contains a lot of other information. So you can investigate, for example, where the Garden of Eden is. You can investigate how that structure resembles Jerusalem. You can see Jesus's feet sticking out the bottom of the map. There's a variety of different types of information here, all positioning it within the Latin Christian framework of the world at the time. So the very structure of the world was representing different historical, different mythical, different religious stories and symbols and patterns of understanding that were taught and believed at the time. And you can use the bibliography to investigate all of these different things. The Ebsdorf map did meet a rather unfortunate end, as it was destroyed in World War II in the Allied bombing. However, luckily, we do have some detailed photographs that were taken and some detailed reproductions that were made before the map was destroyed. So the Hereford map and the Ebsdorf map are the two types of maps that are generally understood as Mapamundi. They're the most famous examples of that genre. However, they're not the only world maps of the time, and some of these world maps looked quite different. The majority of those big wall maps were from the 13th century or so, but we have a bunch of other types of world maps. This cotton world map was made in the 11th century in England. We can tell it was made in England because it has certain letter forms that were only found in Old English at the time. And so this is the cotton map. It has the same structure. You still have Asia at the top. You still have Europe in the bottom left hand and Africa in the bottom right hand. But as you can see, the kinds of information that are contained on this map are radically different than the Hereford map and the Ebsdorf map. And I want to emphasize that while we are talking today largely about European maps, they were not the only maps at the time. There was a large cartographic tradition across the world. Here is a famous Islamic map, the Al-Idrisi map, and it shows the same worldview, or the same world, the same area of the world as the Hereford map does, and the cotton map, but from a slightly different angle. So you can see that the emphasis has shifted, and the ways in which this emphasis shifts affects our understanding of the world, affects what is highlighted in this. And so we can actually learn a lot just from what is put front and center in this map. So this map helps us understand a different worldview at roughly the same time.
All right, so I'm going to take over here and talk a little bit about a very different kind of medieval map, the microbial or zonal maps of the world. The Mapamundi that Helen talked about are sort of the more famous, but they were not the only kind of map that medieval people had, the only way that they represented the world. And this is another one of the ways. This is a map of the world broken into habitable and inhabitable zones. What you're looking at here is sort of a sidelong picture of the world with north at the top, the North Pole at the top, with the letter that looks sort of like a C, and the South Pole at the bottom with the letter that looks like a D. And then you've got sort of frigid zones at the top and the bottom, the habitable zones kind of in the blue, and inhabitable zone sort of along the equator where it was believed to be too hot for anybody to live. So this is a really different way of thinking about how you put the world together and what it means to live in the world. One of the important features of these kind of maps is they tell us very explicitly something that that we as map historians know, but that sometimes gets lost in the general public, which is that medieval people knew that the world was round, was a sphere. The Hereford map and the Ebsdorf map sometimes get understood as showing a flat Earth, or maybe sort of a disk of an Earth. But in fact, what that really was doing is trying to overlay that part of the world onto the globe and then make it work on a flat map surface. But here you can see that they're really working with a spherical Earth and thinking about it as being not just spherical, but also also symmetrical in terms of its habitable and inhabitable zones. So there are a lot of these different kinds of zonal maps, but they all follow basically the same pattern. This one's from the 12th century and is very schematic, right? It just shows the zones. This one is from several hundred years after that, and again shows the zones, but it also is sitting next to a Mapamundi of the world. It's one of these really schematic TO maps. These type of maps weren't exclusive. They didn't think about the world in one way or the other, but thinking about the world in a lot of different ways. So sometimes they appear in text together. So this again is a fairly schematic map of the world, but they got more detailed as well. This one from the 12th century has the schematic zones, but also has geographical elements written into the boxes. You can see where it says Rubrum Mare, the Red Sea, or India, and then temperate zones and temperate zones. So this is a map where the geography is sort of coming into play a little bit. And sometimes the geography looks much more like we would expect a map to look. This map of the world by Abel Fleury from the 10th century is again a zonal map. You can see in the southern hemisphere, they have no idea what's there, so it's blank. The middle is in this sort of red, which is inhabitable, but the northern hemisphere shows the same basic picture of the world that you saw in the Hereford map and the Ebsdorf map and the Cotton map, but now it's sort of turned on its side because we're looking at north as up. You can see the Mediterranean and North Africa and Europe and Asia. So these are again a different kind of representation of the world that's happening alongside the Mapamundi in medieval traditions.
And we've got another whole separate genre of mapping that's also coexisting with both of these two others. This comes up actually in a biography of St. Louis IX of France. So there's this narrative that describes the crusade against Tunis, which is getting off to a really rocky start. Louis and all the crusaders have gotten onto ships, and there's this absolutely terrible voyage. They're sailing across, and everyone's sick. There's seasickness. There's a storm. Louis is at his portable altar praying the way Louis always does. And finally, they get to shore, and they haul out a map, and they show it to Louis, and they say, no, really, we're here. We're where we want to go. And the word they use in that text is Mapamundi. But from what you've seen of what we would call Mapamundi, that doesn't make a lot of sense. You can't recognize a headland from a Mapamundi in the way we would use that term. So probably what's getting described there is this other genre, these sort of navigational charts. These are, as they've come down to us, these are not always things that would have been used for navigation, though many of them probably were at the time, but the survival rate of those is low, as you might expect. But they are compilations of navigational information, and they privilege the kind of information that you might need to sail from point A to point B. So this means that really different information is privileged in a map like this. So we're going to give you an image now. This was an actual sort of fairly early medieval map, but it's a bit clearer in the modern map. So we'll switch you over to one of those so you can see some of these features a little better. What you have is this great attention to the coastline, and this orientation of the coastline around these series of rhumb lines, these geometric lines that sort of give the order, all of these lines crisscrossing this that you can see in the background. The inland, in a sort of more schematic Portolan map, isn't interesting or necessary. You don't put much there, and you don't put much in the water itself. You're only caring about the shoreline. So you wind up with this tremendously detailed map of the shore, but you don't have much else in some of these. A few things that we can sort of contrast this tradition with the other traditions that we've talked about. So for instance, you can contrast this under the understanding of time in these maps. These are fairly regularly updated, at least in the places where people are regularly sailing. So there's this sense of being contemporary that's important to these maps, whereas something of the Mapamundi tradition, often the point of those is to punch through time, to be able to connect something like Jerusalem and Eden. That's a really different way of using time within this construction of space. And you can also contrast it to something like the zonal map, where a zonal map is supposed to point out and explain what does it mean to live in a spherical world. Well, these maps don't so much care about what it means to live in a spherical world. They know the world's spherical, but the math of that's really hard if you're trying to take into account the curvature of the Earth, and it's small as the Mediterranean basin, more or less. You can get away with it. There's some distortion, but what you really care about is direction. How are places related to one another? So you ignore the curvature, you let a little bit of distortion in, you don't highlight it, and you just deal with it. It's sort of a pragmatic approach to space in this context. So we want to emphasize the distinctions between these genres, because the distinctions between these genres are one of the reasons it can be challenging when you're first trying to get into medieval maps as a thing to teach with or as a thing to use. So we do need to emphasize these. There are very different traditions, but that doesn't mean they don't hit each other. So this is a really interesting example, a map called the Catalan Atlas. And what you can see here is the coast is a Portolan chart. The background line construction is a Portolan chart. But the inland, well, you're not putting anything there anyway in a sort of more conventional Portolan chart, so why not draw it like a Mapamundi? Why not give that kind of detail, that kind of interest? So you have these curious hybrids. And in general, there's lots of mapping that takes place outside these relatively clearly constructed and fairly large genres that we've talked about so far. So I'm just going to talk briefly about this one map. This, one of the more common sorts of regional map, when you focus on something a little bit smaller, is a map of the Holy Land. Because whenever you're constructing a map of something that's smaller than the whole world or the whole Mediterranean basin, you're making an inherent argument. This is something that's important enough to be worth mapping. And people made that argument a lot about the Holy Land. This is a particular example by Matthew Paris in a sort of cleaned up modern version that's intended to make this a little bit more legible. It's a bit of a messy manuscript. But the thing to point out about this map is that you have, again, this contrast depending on what you want this map to do. So this map draws the whole Eastern Mediterranean coast as a straight vertical line. Paris knows that's not true. Paris does not care. He's not concerned with the coastline at all, whereas a Portolan chart would absolutely privilege that. He's concerned with the interior and only the interior. So he draws everything in relation to this coast and lets space warp in accordance with that. That's what's important for this map. So yeah, you see the sort of varieties in the construction of space that are all going on at the same time.
And they get smaller than this too. So this is a map of the Holy Land, so a relatively regional map. But medieval people are also mapping much more local space. This is a map of the Chertsey Abbey holdings from the 15th century. It's in Surrey in England, and it's a relatively small geographic area. You've got the Abbey and it's sort of the region around it. It's local rivers and mills and towns, and it's basic holdings. So this is a much more sort of localized piece of geography. And again, as with the map of the Holy Land, the sort of scale doesn't matter too much. The navigation isn't the point here. You're making sort of claims about whose land is, who the land belongs to, and what the Abbey has sort of privilege over. But pieces of mapping get sort of smaller, more detailed than this. Going back to the Holy Land, this is a map of Jerusalem from the 13th century. So there's some medieval maps of cities as well. They are not useful necessarily for navigating your way around town. Especially the Jerusalem maps tend to borrow very heavily from the Mapamundi TO format because they're replicating the sort of space of the earth and the holiness of that space as a sort of Christian battlefield down to sort of the local Jerusalem level. So the city replicates the holiness of the world. But you can see that you've got sort of the major elements of Jerusalem here. You have the Holy Sepulchre and Solomon's Temple and the Temple of the Lord. So the Tower of David. There are a bunch of. It's not that they're ignoring the space that's there or the elements that are there, but the map is doing multiple things. It's both showing you the space and tying it to a more sort of Christological perspective.
And this is another map or plan of the city of Jerusalem. And this one is fun because this is not just a plan of Jerusalem. This is a plan of Jerusalem as it does not yet exist. This is clearly the Jerusalem of Revelations. So you have this very simple diagram that is a square. It has 12 gates, the gates of the 12 tribes of Israel, and you have Civitas Dei, City of God, in the middle of it. This is, by the way, big. This is takes up half the page of a folio. So while this is a very simple diagram, it draws a lot of attention to itself. And the other kind of interesting thing about this is that, simple as it is, it gives cardinal directions. So you have the sort of north, south, east, west markers that position this thing that does not exist but will, that insistently position it in physical space. So there's a kind of rhetoric of precision that, around cartography that can be used to imply importance to things you really want to get across. Even if you don't need this, there's no detail here. There's nothing that you couldn't easily get in a verbal description. This is very simple, but something about having it as a map, that can be important itself.